Harlem, New York. 2:47 p.m. Saturday, March 12, 1960. The afternoon air carried the scent of fresh bread from Sylvia's kitchen, mixed with exhaust fumes from delivery trucks grinding up Lenox Avenue. Inside Goldstein's Market on 135th Street, the atmosphere was suffocating. The store smelled of old produce, industrial bleach, and something else, the sour stench of contempt that had been fermenting for years. Behind the counter stood Morris Goldstein, 54 years old. Pressed white shirt with rolled sleeves, gold watch chain visible across his vest. He owned the building. 4 rental units upstairs, all occupied by families who paid their rent on time. His market occupied the prime ground floor, a cash machine that had been extracting wealth from the neighborhood since 1947. Mayme Johnson stood across from him, composed and elegant in her navy wool coat. She held a small basket containing the essentials: milk, eggs, bread, coffee, sugar. She was a regular customer, always polite, always paid in cash, never caused trouble. The receipt in her hand showed $8.60. The items in her basket were worth $6.15. She had counted every price tag, calculated every tax. The mathematics were simple. The discrepancy was intentional. "There's been a mistake," Mayme said, her voice steady, placing the correct amount on the counter in neat bills and coins. Goldstein didn't look at the money. He swept it into his palm and dropped it into the register, then held out his hand for the additional $2.45. "That's the price for your kind. You don't like it, shop somewhere else." The store went silent. 2 other customers, both black women, froze near the canned goods. They had witnessed this taxation before. Different store, same script. Mayme placed the exact amount she owed on the counter, $6.15, counted precisely. "This is what the items cost." Goldstein's response was swift and brutal. He swept the money onto the floor with his forearm, bills scattering, coins rolling under shelves and into corners. "Pick it up and get out. Don't come back to my store." As Mayme bent to collect her scattered money, Goldstein leaned over the counter, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell your husband his protection money days are over. Tell him the neighborhood's changing, and his kind better learn their place before someone teaches it to them." 2:48 p.m. Mayme Johnson straightened, left her groceries on the counter, and walked toward the exit. She didn't argue, she didn't raise her voice. She simply opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk, leaving Morris Goldstein standing behind his register, smug and satisfied, completely unaware that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. 2:51 p.m. Mayme walked 4 blocks north to the brownstone on West 140th Street. She climbed the steps with measured precision, opened the front door, and found her husband sitting in his study, reading the Amsterdam News, a cup of coffee cooling on the mahogany desk beside him. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson looked up when she entered. He saw something in her face that made him fold the newspaper and set it aside. She told him everything. Every word. Every gesture. Every dollar scattered on the floor. Every witness who had watched her humiliation. Bumpy didn't speak. He didn't move. He sat there for 37 seconds, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the window, calculating something that existed only in his mind. Then he stood, put on his coat, and made a phone call that lasted exactly 42 seconds. 2:54 p.m. Morris Goldstein was still counting his afternoon receipts when his world began to end. He had no idea that the man whose wife he had just humiliated was already making the arrangements to buy the building that housed his store, his home, and his entire future. 72 hours later, Morris Goldstein would stand on the sidewalk outside 347 West 135th Street, holding a cardboard box containing 13 years of his life. watching strangers inventory his shelves while a marshal changed the locks on his own front door. The story of how Morris Goldstein lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to March 12, 1960, to the moment when respect became currency and disrespect became bankruptcy. In 1960, Harlem operated as an economic colony within Manhattan, where money flowed in a single, brutal direction, out. Every morning, an army of merchants drove in from Queens and Westchester, unlocked their steel gates, and spent 12 hours harvesting the wages of working families before driving home with the community's wealth secured in their trunks. The system was extraction disguised as commerce. Grocery stores that weighed light, clothing shops that measured long, pharmacies that doubled prices on basic medicine because the nearest alternative required 2 bus rides. Surrounding it all was a constant layer of contempt. Customers were called boy and girl regardless of age. Women were honey or gal, never ma'am. Complaints were met with smirks and a familiar ultimatum: if you don't like it, go somewhere else. The owners knew there was nowhere else. Mayme Johnson occupied a unique position in this landscape. She was educated, articulate, and carried herself with the bearing of someone who understood power from both sides. She had attended college when most women in Harlem worked domestic jobs. She organized community events, scholarship programs, church fundraisers. Her connection to Bumpy Johnson was known, but she had cultivated her own reputation independent of his influence. She represented legitimacy in a world that often dismissed such concepts. She was Bumpy's bridge between the underworld and respectable society, his proof that he was more than a street boss. She could walk into banks and law offices where his name raised alarms and turn those alarms into appointments. What merchants failed to understand was that this status made disrespecting her exponentially more dangerous than disrespecting him directly. Morris Goldstein had inherited 347 West and 135th Street from his father in 1947. 13 years later, he had never missed a mortgage payment, a fact he mentioned frequently as evidence of his business acumen and moral superiority. What he actually demonstrated was his ability to extract enough money from tenants and customers to satisfy the bank's minimum requirements. Goldstein didn't see people when he looked at his customers. He saw revenue streams with different price tolerances. This thinking had birthed the color tax he had been running for years. A can of tomatoes marked 79 cents would ring up as 95 cents for certain customers. A pound of ground beef priced at $1.40 would somehow cost $1.80 by transaction's end. The additions were never explained. Receipts were deliberately unclear, with smudged numbers and cryptic abbreviations that made verification difficult. Most people paid the inflated amounts because confrontation carried risks beyond financial. The profit margins were substantial. The moral cost was something Goldstein had never calculated because he didn't believe such costs existed. What Goldstein miscalculated was the line between tolerated disrespect and unforgivable humiliation. In Bumpy Johnson's internal code, family insults were capital offenses requiring total destruction, not mere violence. Where most men thought in punches and broken glass, Bumpy measured in property, paper, and precedent. When he listened to Mayme recount how the money hit the floor while other women watched in silence, he filed it under a category reserved for one response only: complete erasure. At 3:08 p.m., Bumpy placed a phone call to Abraham Rosenthal, his attorney. The conversation was brief and specific. Bumpy asked one question: how much to buy 347 West 135th Street? The entire exchange lasted 42 seconds. This was how systematic destruction began. Not with rage or threats, but with a simple real estate inquiry delivered in the same tone someone might use to ask about the weather. Bumpy's philosophy was absolute. You don't just hurt a man who disrespects your wife. You erase him completely. By 6:30 p.m. that evening, Bumpy had made 6 additional phone calls. Morris Goldstein was closing his store, counting his profits, completely unaware that his entire world was being systematically purchased out from under him, one conversation at a time. Sunday, March 13, 1960, 8:15 a.m. The back room of the Red Rooster smelled of stale cigarette smoke, fresh coffee, and something else. The metallic scent of calculated revenge. 4 men sat around a scarred circular table covered in documents, not to socialize but to dissect a financial life. Bumpy Johnson presided with the stillness of a predator studying prey. To his left sat Marcus Webb, his accountant, a thin man who saw the world in columns of profit and loss. To his right, Abraham Rosenthal, his attorney, who translated street justice into legal binding. Across from him sat Samuel Klein, a real estate broker with horn-rimmed glasses who specialized in properties others feared to touch. A man who knew the skeletal structure of every building in Harlem. The target was 347 West 135th Street, and Klein laid the financials on the table like an autopsy report. The building carried a current market value of $42,000 based on comparable sales and rental income potential. Morris Goldstein held the deed, but First National Bank of Harlem held the leash. A mortgage with a remaining balance of $19,000, monthly payments of $270, stretched over 8 more years. This debt was the entry point. Bumpy understood that in the American economic system, the creditor owns the debtor. To control the man, one simply had to purchase his liabilities. What transformed this ordinary financial picture into ammunition was information Bumpy had been collecting for 3 years through his network of informants, clerks, janitors, low-level bank employees who needed money more than loyalty. First National had been systematically skimming interest payments from multiple Harlem properties. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Mortgage statements showed interest calculations at contracted rates, but actual amortization schedules were manipulated to extract additional payments disguised as fees, insurance adjustments, and tax escrow corrections. Bank President Harold Morrison had been running this operation since 1956, generating approximately $18,000 annually in fraudulent charges spread across 47 mortgages. Bumpy had documentation. Ledgers copied by sympathetic clerks. Testimony from property owners who had hired accountants and discovered discrepancies. Correspondence between Morrison and regional officials discussing revenue optimization strategies in coded language that wouldn't survive federal scrutiny. The strategy was surgical: approach the mortgage holder first, present an ultimatum disguised as a business opportunity. Monday, March 14, 11:30 a.m., Bumpy walked into Morrison's private office accompanied by Rosenthal. Morrison was 59 years old, gray suit, gold cufflinks, a man who believed his marble lobby insulated him from street-level consequences. Bumpy placed a manila folder on the mahogany desk and opened a leather briefcase containing $12,000 in used bills, bundled with rubber bands. He didn't threaten. He simply explained that the folder contained documentation of systematic fraud spanning 4 years, affecting dozens of families, generating criminal liability under federal banking regulations. Then came the proposition, delivered with the cold neutrality of a judge reading a sentence. Morrison had 2 choices: sell Goldstein's $19,000 mortgage for $12,000 cash, or face federal audit and criminal investigation. Morrison opened the folder, spent 11 minutes reading, his hands trembling slightly when he closed it. The calculation took less than a minute. Pride was expendable. Federal prison was not. The transaction was executed in the bank's conference room with mechanical precision. Rosenthal handled the paperwork, while Morrison signed the transfer documents, effectively handing over Morris Goldstein's financial soul to a man Goldstein had never met. The legal mechanism was straightforward, immediate foreclosure was impossible, but financial pressure was unlimited. As the new mortgage holder, Bumpy could scrutinize every payment, refuse refinancing requests, and accelerate the loan if any technical violations occurred. The ink dried on the mortgage transfer documents at 2:17 p.m. 5 blocks away, Morris Goldstein was serving customers, making change, completely oblivious to the fact that he now owed his mortgage payments to the husband of the woman he had humiliated 48 hours earlier. Tuesday, March 15th through Friday, March 18th, unfolded with the quiet, devastating precision of a demolition expert planting charges on structural columns. The objective was the methodical emptying of Morris Goldstein's rental income. Executed without violence or threats, only irresistible incentives delivered by well-dressed men who knocked politely on doors during business hours when Goldstein remained downstairs, oblivious to the systematic dismantling of his financial foundation. At 9:10 a.m. Tuesday, Apartment 1A received its first visitor. Samuel and Ruth Perkins, both in their 70s, had endured 9 years of climbing stairs despite Samuel's worsening arthritis. The representative from Crown Property Management offered them a ground-floor apartment in a renovated building on West 138th Street, complete with safety rails and wider doorways. The rent would drop from $95 monthly to $57, a 60% reduction that seemed impossible until the paperwork appeared. Professional movers would handle the transition at no cost. The Perkins signed Wednesday and relocated Thursday, their departure unnoticed by the landlord, counting receipts below. Wednesday evening brought attention to Apartment 2B. James and Patricia Crawford, both 28 with 2 children under 5, had been suffocating in their one-bedroom unit for 3 years. The offer was surgical in its appeal, a 3-bedroom apartment on Edgecombe Avenue with actual closet space and tree-lined views. First month free, $200 for moving expenses, rent only $15 above their current payment. Patricia cried when she read the lease terms. They packed Thursday night and vanished by Friday morning. Thursday afternoon, Dorothy Marshall received a visitor who understood her specific desperation. A single mother working double nursing shifts while raising her 8-year-old daughter, Dorothy paid her sister $40 monthly for informal childcare during evening hours. The offer eliminated this burden entirely. A 2-bedroom apartment with rent reduced by $30 monthly, plus enrollment of her daughter in a supervised after-school program at no cost. The program alone was worth $60 monthly. Dorothy moved Friday afternoon, her daughter already excited about qualified teachers and structured activities. Friday morning, Marcus Green answered his door to find opportunity disguised as employment. The textile factory maintenance worker lived alone in a studio barely large enough for his bed and dresser. The visitor offered him a maintenance supervisor position in one of Bumpy Johnson's residential buildings, salary increase of $18 weekly, with housing included as compensation. The apartment was twice his current space. The job provided stability his factory position never offered. Marcus gave notice that afternoon and moved Friday evening. The financial mathematics were devastating in their simplicity. Goldstein collected $380 monthly in rental income across 4 units. His mortgage payment was $270. His store operated on razor-thin profit margins, typically clearing between $100 and $150 monthly after inventory costs and utilities. The rental income wasn't supplementary revenue, it was structural. Without it, the mortgage payment became an impossible burden for a business that survived on systematic overcharging and customer captivity. Friday, March 18th, 6:00 p.m. Goldstein climbed the stairs for his monthly rent collection ritual. He knocked on the Perkins' door. Silence. The Crawfords' apartment showed no signs of occupancy. Dorothy Marshall's unit was empty, swept clean. Marcus Green's studio contained nothing but impressions in the carpet where furniture once stood. Goldstein stood in the hallway, confusion transforming into panic as he calculated what 4 vacant units meant for his survival. Saturday morning, March 19th, Goldstein received a certified letter from a law office he'd never heard of, informing him that his mortgage had been sold to a private investor and payment terms were being restructured. The signature belonged to Abraham Rosenthal, attorney at law. Goldstein still had no idea who held his financial future. March 20th through April 15th was not a decline. It was a controlled bleed, each cut precisely placed to drain Morris Goldstein's business of its lifeblood while leaving no fingerprints. The first wounds appeared in his supply chain with surgical precision. On Tuesday, March 22nd, the driver for Hudson Valley Dairy refused to unload 40 crates of milk without cash in hand, explaining that corporate policy had changed overnight. By Thursday, Continental Foods, his produce distributor for 11 years, suddenly required cash on delivery instead of the standard 30-day terms that had sustained his inventory management for over a decade. When Goldstein protested, citing their long relationship, the dispatcher offered only corporate speak about credit restructuring affecting multiple accounts. Except when Goldstein called 2 neighboring store owners who used Continental, their credit terms remained unchanged. The cascade accelerated through the final week of March. Reliable Meats canceled his standing Thursday delivery without explanation. The bakery distributor claimed a clerical error had frozen his credit line. His paper goods supplier demanded payment of invoices Goldstein knew had been settled months earlier. By early April, 4 of his 7 regular suppliers had either demanded cash up front or stopped servicing his location entirely, forcing Goldstein to hemorrhage his personal savings just to maintain the illusion of a functioning business. The mathematics were brutal. Without credit terms, he was paying for inventory before selling it, destroying the cash flow that had sustained 13 years of operation. Simultaneously, the customer exodus began through Harlem's organic networks with devastating efficiency. Mrs. Patterson, who had shopped every Tuesday for 6 years, simply stopped coming. The Hendersons, the Williams family, dozens of regulars whose weekly purchases formed his revenue foundation, redirected their feet and their money elsewhere. The mechanism was invisible but systematic. Concerned neighbors intercepting shoppers a block away, church ladies mentioning better prices at the new community market on Lenox Avenue, young men on stoops quietly suggesting that we don't shop there anymore. No boycott was declared. No picket lines formed. The attack was atmospheric, everywhere and nowhere at once, spreading through barbershops and beauty parlors with whispered recommendations that avoided Goldstein's store entirely. Goldstein's paranoia curdled into desperation as he recognized coordination without identifying its source. He suspected organized harassment but found no proof of conspiracy. He filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau about supplier discrimination, contacted police about potential intimidation, only to encounter bureaucratic indifference and polite suggestions that perhaps his business model simply wasn't competitive. The authorities saw a failing merchant, not a targeted victim, because the assault left no evidence of criminal conduct. April 16th arrived with mathematical inevitability. Goldstein's daily receipts had plummeted 60%. His bank account contained $143. His mortgage payment was $270. He missed his first payment in 13 years, triggering acceleration clauses buried in legal language he'd never bothered to read. The fine print was unambiguous. A single missed payment gave the mortgage holder the right to demand immediate payment of the entire remaining balance of $19,000. Desperate solutions failed systematically. Goldstein placed advertisements for the vacant apartments, offering reduced rent and flexible terms. Applicants appeared, viewed the units, expressed genuine interest, then vanished after brief conversations with people waiting on street corners. Bumpy's network operated with shadow government efficiency, guiding every qualified applicant away from 347 West 135th Street through quiet warnings delivered in the community's natural gathering places. April 30th brought foreclosure notice, delivered by certified mail with legal finality. 30 days to pay the full balance or lose everything. Goldstein's frantic calls to Abraham Rosenthal's office met with cold dismissal. The debt was non-negotiable. Payment or auction, no third option existed. May 15, 1960, Morris Goldstein finally asked the right question to the wrong person. Exhausted and financially ruined, he approached a local businessman and demanded to know who was orchestrating his destruction. The man looked at him with something resembling pity and spoke two words: Bumpy Johnson. For the first time, Goldstein understood he wasn't fighting competitors or market forces. He was fighting a king. May 30th, 1960, 10:00 a.m. The foreclosure auction convened in a sterile third-floor courtroom at the Harlem courthouse, deliberately scheduled during peak business hours when working people couldn't attend and legitimate competition was minimized. The room smelled of floor wax and stale legal documents, its wooden benches populated only by court officials shuffling paperwork, and two men separated by 30 feet of physical distance and an unbridgeable chasm of financial power. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was surgical, designed to maximize control while maintaining the appearance of legal propriety. Morris Goldstein sat near the front, his pressed suit showing wear at the elbows, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a cashier's check representing the collective sacrifice of his extended family. His brother in Philadelphia had mortgaged his own home. His cousin in Baltimore had liquidated a retirement account. His sister in Boston had sold jewelry passed down through 2 generations. Together they had assembled $20,000, believing that family loyalty and desperate determination could somehow compete against the invisible forces orchestrating his destruction. Hidden in his jacket pocket was a second check for $7,000, borrowed that morning against his life insurance policy after paying penalties and surrender fees, money intended to provide for his wife if he died, now wagered on his financial survival. The second bidder occupied the back row with the relaxed demeanor of someone executing routine business. Thomas Whitmore, a real estate acquisition specialist, carried a leather portfolio and instructions that were absolute: acquire the property at any cost below $50,000. He had attended 47 foreclosure auctions in 18 months and lost exactly 3. His charcoal suit and burgundy tie suggested prosperity, not desperation. He checked his watch frequently, as if the destruction of a man's life were merely a scheduling inconvenience. At 10:04 a.m., court-appointed auctioneer Bernard Walsh called the proceedings to order. The property description was read with bureaucratic monotony: 347 West 135th Street, 4 residential units, 1 commercial space, assessed value $42,000, minimum opening bid $18,000 to satisfy outstanding debt and legal fees. Walsh's voice echoed in the nearly empty courtroom as he called for opening bids. Goldstein stood first, his voice cracking as he announced $20,000, the sum of his family's collective sacrifice. For 17 seconds, silence filled the room. Then Whitmore raised his hand with casual indifference, and stated $25,000, his tone suggesting he was ordering lunch rather than destroying a life. The number landed like a physical blow, draining color from Goldstein's face as he calculated the impossible mathematics of competing against apparently unlimited resources. But desperation manufactures courage from bankruptcy. Goldstein reached into his jacket, withdrew the second check, and stood again. His voice was stronger now, fueled by the rage of a man with nothing left to lose. $27,000, every asset he could liquidate, every favor he could call, every dollar his family could sacrifice. It was his final card, his entire financial existence pushed into the center of the table. Whitmore didn't hesitate. He didn't consult notes or make phone calls. He simply stated $35,000. Cash, available for immediate transfer. The words fell with the finality of a judge's gavel. Walsh called for additional bids twice, following legal protocol, but the room remained silent except for Goldstein's labored breathing. At 10:11 a.m., Walsh declared the property sold to the anonymous investment group represented by Thomas Whitmore. The entire proceeding had lasted 7 minutes. After the auction concluded, Goldstein approached Whitmore, demanding to know who had purchased his life's work. Whitmore handed him a business card bearing Abraham Rosenthal's name and law office address, then walked away without further conversation. The revelation was complete. The proxy worked for Rosenthal, who worked for Ellsworth Johnson. The building that had been Goldstein's foundation for 13 years was now an asset in the portfolio of the man whose wife he had humiliated. May 31, 1960, brought eviction notice delivered by court-martial. 72 hours to vacate premises and remove all personal property. Goldstein launched into frantic salvage attempts that met systematic obstruction at every turn. The delivery truck he'd rented was pulled over 3 blocks from the courthouse and impounded for safety violations that materialized from nowhere. Faulty brake lights, worn tires, expired inspection sticker. Violations that had gone unnoticed for months suddenly became enforcement priorities. Storage attempts failed with rehearsed precision. Every warehouse in Harlem reached full capacity when Goldstein called. 4 facilities, identical conversations, apologetic managers explaining they had no space for 20 boxes, no room for shelving units, no availability for a single man's ruined inventory. The coordination was invisible but total, the city itself rejecting his possessions. June 2, 1960, 8 a.m., eviction day arrived with gray skies and light drizzle. When the city marshal appeared with 2 deputies to oversee the removal, Bumpy Johnson was standing across the street, leaning against a black Cadillac, perfectly still. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was simply watching, having come to witness the final act personally. This wasn't business anymore. This was education. The eviction execution began at 8:14 a.m. with the bureaucratic violence of systematic dismantling. City marshals moved through 347 West 135th Street with mechanical efficiency, converting 13 years of Morris Goldstein's labor, accumulation, and illusion into cardboard geometry. Industrial shelving units that had displayed overpriced goods were dismantled with power tools, their metal frames scraping against doorways as deputies maneuvered them onto the wet sidewalk. Personal belongings from the upstairs apartment emerged in garbage bags and salvaged crates, family photographs, kitchen utensils, a menorah wrapped in newspaper. The accumulated debris of a life that had believed ownership provided immunity from consequences. The morning drizzle turned cardboard boxes soggy, their contents visible through deteriorating walls as neighbors gathered on stoops and corners, watching in silence as public theater delivered a lesson everyone understood without narration. At 8:47 a.m., Goldstein emerged from the building carrying a framed business license, clutched against his chest like a shield. He set it down on the wet pavement, and the glass shattered on impact, fragments scattering like his shattered assumptions about power and protection. He straightened his back and looked across the street. That was the moment of recognition. Leaning against the black Cadillac, motionless as a monument, stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, his eyes fixed on the eviction with the detached interest of an architect inspecting completed construction. Recognition arrived with the force of physical impact. Goldstein understood everything in that instant. The timing, the precision, the complete financial destruction, the empty apartments, the supplier problems, the foreclosure, none of it had been coincidence. Every element had been orchestrated by the man standing 40 feet away, watching the final act of a revenge play written the moment Mayme Johnson's money hit his store floor. Desperation overrode survival instinct. Goldstein crossed the street through light traffic, his voice rising with each step, shouting accusations that echoed off brownstone facades. He called Bumpy a criminal, a destroyer of legitimate business, demanding to know what gave him the right to obliterate a man's livelihood over a simple misunderstanding. His voice cracked with rage and desperation as he stood 3 feet from Bumpy, fists clenched, demanding answers, demanding justice, demanding something that would make sense of his obliteration. Bumpy's response was absolute silence. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon or signal his driver. He simply maintained eye contact with the empty expression of a man who had delivered a message requiring no verbal translation. The silence was more devastating than any threat could have been, communicating with brutal clarity that Goldstein's outrage was irrelevant, his threats meaningless, his existence reduced to a cautionary tale. After 43 seconds of one-sided confrontation, Bumpy turned, opened the Cadillac's door, and drove away without speaking a single word. The cost analysis was precise and surgical. Bumpy had invested approximately $31,000 total, $12,000 for the mortgage purchase, $7,000 in tenant relocation incentives, $3,000 in legal fees, and $9,000 to outbid Goldstein at auction. For a man who controlled significant portions of Harlem's underground economy, this was a moderate expense. But the return on investment was immeasurable. By noon, the story spread through Harlem like wildfire, transmitted through barbershops and beauty parlors, church basements and street corners. The narrative was simple and terrifying. A shopkeeper disrespected Bumpy Johnson's wife, and 72 days later that shopkeeper stood on a sidewalk watching his entire life packed into cardboard boxes. June 3, 1960, renovation began immediately. Scaffolding appeared, the Goldstein's market sign came down, and the store was transformed into a community market with transparent pricing and fair practices. Bumpy installed the Henderson family as management, local residents known for their integrity and deep community ties. The rental units filled within a week with carefully chosen tenants, a teacher, a nurse, a transit worker, all community members in good standing, who paid reasonable rent and received responsive maintenance. Mayme Johnson never visited the scene of her vindication. She never asked for revenge, and Bumpy never told her the details. But she understood its necessity in their world, where respect was currency and disrespect was debt that compounded until it consumed everything. Morris Goldstein made a simple miscalculation on March 12, 1960. He assumed that ownership of property made him untouchable. He assumed that racial superiority trumped economic power. He assumed that Mayme Johnson was just another customer who would accept humiliation as the price of shopping in his store. He was wrong on all counts. In Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, respect wasn't optional, it was the fundamental currency that determined who prospered and who disappeared. Goldstein learned what dozens of others had learned before him: When you scatter a queen's money on the floor, you don't just lose a customer. You lose everything. The building still stands on West 135th Street. Different ownership now, different management, but the lesson remains carved into Harlem's memory. A reminder that in the mathematics of the street, some debts compound until they consume everything you own.